You know, there's one strange result of your becoming well educated. As you learn to read and enjoy the best that our civilization has to offer in literature or in art or science or music or mathematics, one strange thing starts to happen with regard to your most deeply held beliefs. And it doesn't matter what those beliefs are, whether they are beliefs in politics or God or race or saving the whales. As you become well educated and learning how to learn, discovering what it means to listen with concentration and understanding, then comes this particular strangeness. You want to comprehend your deeply held beliefs in the light of Western civilization of these last 2,500 years. Specifically, you want to hear, when you're well educated, you want to hear the other perspective on your beliefs. You want to read the best that the opposition to your beliefs has to offer. You want to hear the best atheist, or the best Nazi, or the best socialist. You want to hear them with the same enthusiasm that as you experienced when you heard the best advocates for your belief. Selecting the right stuff to read. Even if you had read everything that's been written up to the present moment, you couldn't keep up. You'd sit down in a chair right now, assuming you've read everything there's ever been written up to this moment, and they start to hand you books that are coming fresh off the press, and they hand you one book a day, or 2 books a day, or 10 books a day, which is more nearer the truth. You couldn't keep up with stuff that's happening nowadays, much less read all the old stuff. You'll never read it all. There's got to be some guidelines for choosing what books to read. Last time we met, I talked about Emerson's rule number 1 for choosing books to read. Namely, don't read any book unless it's at least a year old. Today, let's add a second thought from Emerson's rules of what books to read. He wrote that you should only read books that he called famed books, what we might call famous books. The great texts, not just the popular bestsellers. Carl Van Doren made a kind of neat distinction between greatness and popularity. He wrote, a book is great when it speaks to the best minds. It's popular when it speaks to most minds. There's a lifetime of reading and rereading in just the great texts. Read a trashy book, sort of like Kleenex. Sort of like Kleenex. One quick blow can be fun, but who wants to ponder over it once you've been through it? Emerson's rule number 2, read only the famed books. And just like his rule number 1, which was read only books that are at least a year old, I've got to admit that I occasionally violate those rules. I go wandering in the stacks of the University of Nevada, Reno Library, and occasionally I see a book on the shelf that's less than a year old, just been published, and I end up adding it to the stack of books that I'm going to carry home. Sometimes that turns out to be a good choice, and more often than not, that choice, violating Emerson's rules, turns out to be a fizzle. It's just like eating what I shouldn't eat. Most of the times, I try and follow the rules, and it leads me to having more happiness. There's so much in just the great texts that will hold pleasure for you for the rest of your life. History's come in all different shapes. This man here is Napoleon, famous sort of drawing after a painting. And there's lots of histories of wars and histories of famines and politics. But how often have you heard a little tiny history of mathematics? Not a real serious history of mathematics, but a kind of, I don't know, the improbable history of mathematics. I think that may be copyrighted, I'm not sure. But a not quite totally non-fiction history of mathematics. A lot to be learned. So sit back, enjoy, and I think this will be the most enjoyable history of mathematics you've ever heard. Starts long time ago, hundreds of years, thousands of years ago, millions of years ago. And I talk to some people that say, well, numbers don't mean anything to me. Then I guess it doesn't matter how long ago it was. But it was a long time ago. Long before maybe we even had cities or agriculture. We had, let's start with a shepherd. A shepherd, and he had his little flock of sheep. And in the olden days, at night there were wolves that would come and attack the sheep. So very often they would put the sheep in a kind of U-shaped enclosure, almost a circle, made out of thorn bushes that wolves couldn't get over. And the shepherd every evening would have the sheep come in, and as they came in, when they were all in, then he would lie down in front of the door, in front of the circle there, so that any wolf that came to attack the sheep would have to go through him. He was the door, and those were the sheep. Well, when he had one sheep, it wasn't too hard to keep track, and two sheep, you know, Alfredo and Betty, or whatever he called them, it wasn't too hard to keep track of them. But when he got a huge number of sheep, like 4 sheep, he had no language to talk about 1, 2, 3, 4 as we've got nowadays that we're taught in grammar school. So he had to have some way to make sure that all of the sheep were inside the shepherd's fold before he lay down and went to sleep at night. He'd hate to leave one of them, you know, out there in the wilderness, because then that sheep would surely be attacked. One way they did it was, suppose he had these many sheep, 4 of them there. We call them 4. But he didn't know numbers at all. He might have taken 4 crayons and put them in his left pocket, and then as each sheep came through, as Alfredo came through, he takes 1 crayon and puts it in his other pocket. Then when the second sheep comes through, he takes a 2nd crayon. Then he takes a 3rd crayon as the 3rd sheep comes through. And he might have used stones. I don't know. And if there was 1 left over, that meant that there was 1 sheep out there to be found. He didn't necessarily have names for this, 1, 2, 3, and 4, but transferring them over, when they were all transferred over, he knew he had them all in there, and he could lie down in front of the shepherd's fold. One other way it was done was to take a stick and make notches in the stick. And then he'd put his thumb on the first notch when the first sheep came through, and then move his thumb to the 2nd notch after the 2nd one came through, and the next notch and the next notch. And if his thumb was at the top notch, by the time the sheep had all come in, he knew he had all the sheep. He had a happy life, and the numbers that he needed were just the notches on a stick, or passing crayons or stones from one hand or one pocket to the other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. The natural numbers were all the math he needed. He didn't need to multiply them or anything, and he was a very happy shepherd. That was the way perhaps numbers began. After a while, he might have found names for the different notches in the stick, so that he could say and brag to his fellow shepherds, "Hey, I've got 16 sheep. Ha ha." And the other shepherd might say, "I've got 18." And then they could argue as to which number was bigger or whatever else. But time moved on. And the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on, they weren't the only things that were perhaps needed. Cities were being built. Towns, villages. And then there were merchants transporting spices and goods and gold from one country to the other country, back and forth. And at the flea markets, or whatever you call them, the bazaars, you'd have merchants there selling goods. Well, one merchant used to sell rice. So here you'd sell his 10 pounds of rice. There you go, 10 pounds of rice. 10 pounds of rice for sale, $10. $10 for 10 pounds of rice, he'd say. And he was making lots of money because he could figure out enough mathematics so that he could do his accounting and pay the IRS or whatever was in existence back there thousands of years ago. But one day, a little widow woman came up to the merchant who was selling his, I got my 10 pounds of rice here, $10. And the widow woman said to him, "Oh, sir, I am very old, and I shall soon die. I will never eat 10 pounds of rice in the few days that are left to me. Let me buy half a box of rice." And the merchant said, "There's no such thing as a half. I can't believe that. No such thing as a half. What does 1 over 2 mean? It's ridiculous." But the widow woman persisted and showed him sort of what half of a box would be like. And she said, "I'll pay you $6 for a half a bag or half a box. And you normally get $10 for the whole box." Well, it didn't take long for that merchant to figure out, hey, this fraction stuff is great. $6 for a half a box when I normally sell a whole box for 10? Ooh! Instantly, he learned fractions. A natural number divided by another natural number. And he learned about them and adding, and he could add them up, and he was happy. And so he put up a new sign the next day, $10 for a box of rice, and sale, $6 for half a box. Now, since many people didn't know about fractions much, that sounded like a pretty good sale. Wow, it costs less than a whole box. It's only $6. And the merchant became rich. Uses of mathematics. One day the shepherd came into town to see the big sights and enjoy the neon lights that were happening back there 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And he came across the merchant and his sign, which said 1 over 2, 1/2 box for $6. And the shepherd didn't know about fractions. All he needed was sheep, and all he needed was to put his thumb in the stick and do the natural numbers. So he looked at 1 over 2, and he thought, "Oh, is that 12? 12 boxes for $6? And the merchant explained to him, "No, half a box is you cut it in 2 pieces, equal pieces, and that's a half." And the shepherd couldn't figure it out. Just didn't work for him. And so the merchant was trying to explain to him, for example, 1/2 plus 1/2, said the merchant to the shepherd, is equal to 1. Shepherd says, "That's crazy. If you take my sheep and cut it in half, and then take 2 halves and try and put them back together, it's not as good as 1 sheep. That 1/2 business fractions are crazy. They are nuts. No way." And he argued back with the merchant, back and forth. And finally the shepherd, a little bit wiser, left to go back home to his sheep. And the numbers that God had given him, the 1, 2, 3 on the stick, were all that anybody would ever need, he averred. Years passed. The towns grew larger. Scientists arose. And there was a man who was studying thermometers. And he was trying to get the coldest temperature that could be obtained. You know how cold it is to put your hand in ice water. Well, he was trying even worse. He mixed fingernail polish remover, acetone, with ice water and stirred that up. Ooh, was it cold. And he was building a thermometer, so he plunged a thermometer into that acetone ice mixture and watched the mercury go down, 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 all the way down to far down as it would go. And then he took his crayon and marked on the glass tube that, and he called it 0 degrees, because nothing could ever be colder than that. And then he marked up from 0 degrees to 1 degree to 2 degrees. And from the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, he invented the whole numbers. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He needed a 0. And so there was a 0 there. Those are another extension of the numbers. One day, since he might have been in South Dakota or something, it got so cold outside, with the wind blowing, and snow coming down, that as he looked at his thermometer, it was 5 degrees and then 4 degrees. And every day he would put out as a public service announcement on his sign what the temperature was. So he put out 4 degrees. And it got colder and colder, down to 0. And then you know what happened. It went below 0 in temperature. He didn't know what to do. So he wrote 1, 2, 3, 4 down below that 0. But how do you say? He put 4 then, because it was 4 degrees below 0, but he didn't know how to make that different from the 4 degrees above 0. So he put a little minus sign in front of the 4 if it was 4 degrees below. And he had invented the negative numbers. Why did he invent them? He invented them because he needed them. It's a great reason for any of the mathematics. The merchant needed a half a box, so he invented the numbers. And the thermometer man needed negative numbers. Also, the merchant started to need negative numbers when the tax collector came around and said that he owed 800 denarii, and the merchant only had 300 denarii to his name, so he was minus 500 denarii in the hole. Well, you know what happened. The shepherd, getting older, maybe wiser, wandered into town and saw the thermometer man's sign with a minus 4 degrees written up there. And the shepherd wandered into the thermometer man's shop and said, you got a thing in front of your 4. A bar. What's the bar mean? And the thermometer man explained, well, that's minus 4 degrees, which is different than 4 degrees. And the shepherd says, well, how can 4 degrees be different than 4 with a bar degrees? And the thermometer man says, well, 4 degrees is different than minus 4 degrees. They're 8 degrees apart from each other. And the shepherd couldn't figure it out. No, you're going to drive me crazy. How can 4 degrees be different than 4 degrees with a bar in front of it? You know, and they got into a little bit of a verbal and possibly physical fight. The shepherd was screaming, I can't have minus 4 sheep. That doesn't make sense. Are those ghost sheep? I have no use for them. And the shepherd, after the fight, headed home to his sheep, claiming, I got my stick, I got my thumbnail, and I need 1, 2, 3, 4. That's all I need, and that's all that nature intended me to have. Meanwhile, commerce and thermometers and accountants all needed negative numbers and fractions, and those things became part of the numbers that we know. The natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The whole numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then add the negatives, and you have the integers. The thermometer man had the integers. Minus a million, minus 999,999, all the way down to 0, and then up again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to for as far as you want to go. A wonderful world. About 2,300 years ago, story goes on. Pythagoras and his group and the rest built a right triangle in which the two legs, the shorter sides, were each equal to 1. And they had the Pythagorean theorem that they had proven. They were the first culture, as far as I know, to prove that one leg of a triangle plus the other leg of a triangle, each squared, is equal to the hypotenuse squared when you're in a right triangle. And they worked with some mathematics, which I won't do here. It takes about 10 minutes or so. And they showed that the length of the hypotenuse couldn't be a fraction or a whole number or an integer. It couldn't. No fraction would ever equal 1 squared plus 1 squared square rooted. Oh, that was crazy. The length of an isosceles right triangle, the hypotenuse, where the legs are each 1, which we call the square root of 2, is the length, but no fraction will ever equal the square root of 2. That was proved about 2,300 years ago. And they went crazy. The Greeks were originally studying both numbers and geometry. And when they discovered this and proved that no fraction would ever equal that length, they sort of edged away from algebra, from numbers, and went toward geometry without naming lengths directly. It was crazy, they thought. This was irrational. Nuts. And the square root of 2, which is not equal to any fraction, is an irrational number. Oh, well, they had no use for it, or they couldn't figure it out, so they just went like the shepherd went, back away from it because it scared them. And but as time went on and measurements needed to be made, this irrational numbers, square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 5, those are some irrational numbers. There's lots more of different kinds. Pi, which is the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter. All kinds of things are irrational numbers. Were useful. And they were useful, they got used. And even if they had that bad name, the insane numbers, the irrational numbers, they're called, those are used in mathematics today. The numbers like 1, 2, 3, and minus 17, and 32 over 59 are called then the rational numbers. So we've got the sane numbers and the insane numbers. That's what rational and irrational means. You'd think the story would stop right there. We have filled up the entire number line with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the minus numbers, minus the negative numbers, the fractions, the irrational numbers. Any point you name on a number line is either a rational or an irrational number. You'd think the story would stop. Got one more step. I don't know, about 500 years ago, give or take, somewhere in there, they were playing with numbers again. By this time, the shepherd was long dead. And they were thinking, well, if I take a positive number and I multiply it times itself, like 7 times 7, I get a positive answer. If I take 0 and multiply it times itself, I get 0. If I take a negative number, like minus 5, and multiply it times itself, minus 5 times minus 5, it's plus 25. That takes about 10 minutes, 15 minutes to prove. I could do that, and I've done that in geometry and algebra classes. But you can prove it's true. Well, wait a minute, if the positive numbers squared are positive, 0 squared is 0, and the negative numbers squared are all positive, what number times itself equals -1? No number is what you think offhand, because it's not positive squared, or positive number times themselves are positive, 0 times itself is 0, negative numbers times themselves are positive. No number, it seems, when times itself would equal -1. Well, guess what? Just like we invented 1/2, just like we invented the square root of 2, just like we invented 1, 2, 3, 4, we invented those numbers. You weren't walking along the road someday, driving along in the forest, and you come and you trip over, and there is a big golden 5. The numbers aren't out there. The numbers are what we have invented. So, a number times itself to equal -1. Well, the answer, well, we invent a number. That number we're going to call I, little I. So I times I is equal to -1. Well, you can say, well, that number is not positive. I is not positive. And I'll say, Well, that number I could be negative, because a negative times a negative is positive. So I isn't negative. And I say, And I isn't 0, because 0 times 0 isn't -1. And I say, Then you say, well, I doesn't exist. And I say, I exists. Well, I don't see it. Where is it? How can it be if it's not positive, negative, 0? Do you know you're sounding just like the shepherd when he had, well, if it ain't 1, 2, 3, 4, it can't be a half. It can't be, there's no such number as a half a sheep. Same thing happens over and over again in mathematics. When we invent something new in a number system, there is always the derriere guard who says, well, it can't be true because I don't know about it. I. And in fact, just like they call the square root of 2 an irrational number, a nuts number, they called I an imaginary number. Just trying to lay a bad name on it. I is just a regular number. And I times I is -1. 3 times I is 3i. I plus I is equal to 2i. You can do arithmetic with I. It's a number. But you think, what use is it? Well, stick around. You take calculus, for example, which is the first course in mathematics at college. And the first semester goes by, and the second semester goes by, and it's usually about the third semester I appears. It's needed. You got to do it in order to do engineering. And in fact, planes wouldn't fly nowadays, or machines wouldn't be built if we didn't have I to use in our calculations. So the number system got larger, and what was the natural numbers, and then the whole numbers, then the integers, then the fractions added with the rational numbers, then the irrational numbers, and now we add the imaginary numbers to it, and we get what is called the complex numbers. That's every number that I've named so far is a complex number. The story may go on further, but I'm not going to take it any further. The point, in part, is that we invent math to reflect the world that we live in. Just like we invent our metaphysics in philosophy, or our art to reflect the world we see, or the music to reflect the world we experience. Mathematics is a reflection of that external world.